let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
Here's the pitch to Willie. There's a liner straight to Richardson. The ball game is over and the World Series is over. Willie McCovey hit it like a bullet. A line drive right straight to Bobby Richardson at second base. And that ball got out of his reach. The Giants would have been the winner. Now it's the Yankees.
My guest today is author, journalist, and commentator David Krell. He is a noted historian and baseball researcher. He is also a regular speaker at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and at the Society for American Baseball Research, SABR, conferences. Krell is the chair of SABR's Northern New Jersey chapter and Spring Training Research Committee. He is the author of some outstanding books, including Our Bums, The Brooklyn Dodgers in History, Memory, and Popular Culture, and the book The New York Mets in Popular Culture, which was featured in an earlier History A Go-Go podcast, so make sure you check that one out as well. His most recent work is 1962, Baseball and America in the Time of JFK. Of 1962, Jerry Milani of the Sports Media Report states, Krell's look at 1962 hits the mark on a less recognized year that in retrospect had as many twists and turns as the pennant races and World Series, and like McCovey's drive, might have ended very differently. And we are very pleased to have the noted historian and author with us today. Welcome, David.
Hey, Rob. How are you?
I'm doing really well, and it's great to have you back.
Thanks so much.
Now, from this book, it's really fun. It's like a tour down memory lane, thinking of the 60s. It's so much fun to go through the book. Got a real passion for baseball, which we all know, but from the book, I see a real passion for culture and history. But why did you end up on 1962?
Well, I originally set out to write a book about the 1962 baseball season, focusing on the New York Mets and the Houston Colt 45s, both expansion teams. And I was in this writing workshop taught by a literary agent named Ryan Fisher Harbach. And I had written a book called Our Bums that came out of that workshop, taught by Ryan. So when I went back to the workshop, I said, I have this great idea, 1962, New York and Houston. And Ryan said, books with a broader topic get a broader readership. So think about it. And I went home that night, and there were certain things that I knew for sure about 1962. I knew the films Advise and Consent and To Kill a Mockingbird premiered that year. I knew the Dick Van Dyke Show was on the air. I knew the Flintstones were on the air. I didn't know that there were 3 Mercury missions. I didn't know that Kennedy gave the Cuban Missile Crisis speech just a few months after he gave a speech at Yale, which really focused on his sense of humor and showed how funny he was because he was a Harvard guy. And there he is at Yale and giving a very tongue-in-cheek speech. I didn't know the film Lolita premiered that year. There were so many different topics and subtopics that arose from just a simple Google search. So when I came back to the class, I said, I think this has to be half baseball, half everything else. And it got a pretty good response, so I knew I was on the right track.
Well, that's the fun part of it, though, David. I really enjoyed that part of it. Of course, the baseball fans will love it because it's a great story in 62 with really amazing teams and great players.
Sure.
But then you tie the history and the culture to it. It's really a fun read.
Thank you.
David, it is tradition here, as you know, to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today we have Old Slugger Pale Ale from the Cooperstown Brewing Company of picturesque Cooperstown, New York. Old Slugger is the flagship beer of the brewery and is brewed with two-row English pale and crystal malts, and balanced with Mount Hood, Cascade, and Fuggle hops. And if you find yourself in the home of the Baseball Hall of Fame, make your way over to the Cooperstown Brewing Company and hammer one of these delicious pale ales. Remember, the best way to enjoy the podcast is with one of our featured brews. Also, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. It's the only way to get the newest episodes right away. And to all the listeners from over 1,000 cities from around the globe, I have to say thank you. It is your interest that makes the show possible. And now I raise my old Slugger Pale Ale very high. And for all of those, past and present, who dig into the box, step up to the plate, and take a swing, I say cheers. So the picture on the cover, that is JFK throwing out that pitch, where'd that picture come from?
That is from the JFK Library, and that is a photo of the president throwing out the first ball at the All-Star game, which was held in Washington that year. Kennedy was a football guy, not really a baseball guy, but he did the ceremonial obligation that Eisenhower had done and Truman had done, where you go to the stadium and throw out the first pitch to inaugurate the Washington baseball team's season. And when I came across that photo, I said, this has to be the cover. I hope that University of Nebraska Press, my publisher, I hope they put this on the cover, because I can't think of a better photo.
And as you mentioned, JFK is really a football guy. Through the book, you don't see any true interactions between Kennedy and some of the players that you might see with some of the actors like Frank Sinatra or some of the other football players that he had interactions with. He really wasn't a baseball guy.
Well, they came to the office for photo ops. Stan Musial was there for the All-Star game, and there are photos of him with Kennedy in the Oval Office. But that's more of a ceremonial thing when celebrities are in town. I don't know if it happens so much now because we just live in too busy a society. But back then, you can go to the JFK Library and see an abundance of photos from actors and athletes of the day.
And I'm glad you brought up Stan Musial. You know that, David. I got to
Sure. St. Louis.
I got to bring up my Cardinals. Yeah, absolutely.
Bet.
You know, and that year in 62 is the year that Stan Musial, at age 41, batted over .330, had a great year.
Right.
And that's where he broke all those records, those National League records, which eventually will be overtaken by Hank Aaron. But 62 was that year when he broke all of those records.
Yeah, he proved that age is just a number for some people. And one thing that he and Kennedy had in common was people busting on them about their age. People said Kennedy was too young to be president, and other people said Musial was too old to be playing baseball. And they both defied their respective critics.
In the good old USA, where baseball is the game, many records in the book now have his famous name. Stanley F. Musial, swinging Stan the man. He's the man that thrills the fans, swinging Stan the man. Stan the man, Stan the man. When he steps up to the plate, the pitcher shakes a chill. Oh my gosh, that's Dosh by gosh, waiting for the kill. Stanley F. Musial, swinging Stan the man. He's the man that thrills the fans, swinging Stan the man.
So the 5 teams that you really concentrate on, and justifiably so, the Yankees, the Dodgers, and the Giants, such iconic players on those teams.
Right.
But then you also cover the Mets and the Colt 45s.
Right.
Would you touch on each one of those teams and why it was so important to include them in 1962?
Sure. Well, I wasn't too far into the research before I hit on the paradigm of giving each of those teams a chapter. It was too bulky to do the whole season line by line, week by week, etc. So I figured, okay, I'll have these teams get a chapter, and then the rest of the book will be Kennedy, the space program, movies, television, etc. So Houston, New York, both expansion teams, they need the chapters. And the Giants and Dodgers had tied, forcing a 3-game playoff, which, as you know, Rob, was pretty rare back then.
Right.
And then the Yankees and the Giants play in the World Series that goes 7 games. So I had a lot of fun doing those chapters, especially Houston, and I'll tell you why. At the Sabre Convention in Houston in 2014, I had taken a day off from the lectures and the seminars, and I went to the University of Houston. That's where George Kirksey's papers are located. Kirksey was a public relations executive, and he helped the Houston Colt 45s get off the ground. They would later be renamed the Astros. But in these papers, the archivist showed me media projections, demographic studies, income projections, team newsletters, ownership breakdowns, internal memoranda, letters, and just an abundance of material. Now, it's very hard for a researcher to find, I would say, origin sources, the sources that will outline for you the origins of the team. It's extraordinarily difficult to find because a lot of these teams have been around for 70, 80, 90, 100 years, and it's not going to be easy to find the original papers that created the Mets or the Phillies or the Reds. So when I found this treasure trove, I was so excited, and that gave me the impetus to set this book apart from some other scholarship. And there hadn't been a lot written about Houston. You hear a lot about the Mets, 62, and you graciously had me on your show a few months ago to talk about the anthology that I edited, The New York Mets in Popular Culture. And everyone's fond of talking about the 62 Mets because they were so lousy and they had the term lovable losers. But hardly anyone has written about Colt 45s. So I knew that I was onto something. And then, of course, the other three teams, the Dodgers, the Giants, and the Yankees, I started to dig a little deeper because I hadn't read too much about the Giants. The Dodgers, I had done a book about the Brooklyn Dodgers. I had read quite a bit about the LA Dodgers. But the Giants, another ball club that does not get as much scholarship as it deserves. So a lot of that material was new to me. And of course, Rob, we talk about the Yankees, and the Yankees from the late 40s to the mid-60s. The word that comes across, at least in conversations I have, is dominant.
Right.
People talk about how dominant they were, especially fans who were around at that time. Now, when you go to Baseball Reference or even Wikipedia and you chart the World Series winners, they did not dominate the competition like we're talking about. Because to go 7 games is not dominating the competition. They did not win in 4 games. They did not win in 5 games a lot. A couple of those World Series against the Dodgers went 7 games. 55 went 7 games when the Dodgers won. 52 and 53 went 7 games. You have the Giants series in 62 going 7 games. You had very tough NL competition against the vaunted Yankees of Mantle and Berra and Skowron, etc. So I really wanted to make that point, and I was just so enamored when I got into the research, and it was more a case of exclusion than inclusion because I had so much written in the draft that the editors said, "Great job, you have to cut it by about 20%." And it was a lot to cut, and anybody will tell you, any writer will tell you, rule number 1, be prepared to throw your darlings overboard. Those darling paragraphs, those amazing segues, those transitions, those narratives, those descriptions that you spent a week writing, forget it. They have to go because you can't have a book that's that length if the editor says it's not possible. So you have to respect the page limit and the restrictions.
And also that year, interestingly, of course, Dodger Stadium, which is the Taj Mahal of baseball.
Yes.
But there were a couple of other stadiums, Washington Stadium, and I think in Houston, that stadium was new. Was it not a new stadium, but it was just new to the league?
Yeah, Colt Stadium was a lousy place to play and a lousy place to watch a baseball game. It was muggy, as it always is. Well, not always, but as it often is in Houston. And the mosquitoes are out. So the Astrodome in 65, when it debuts, is it's like manna from heaven. It's such a gift. And that ushered in a new era. You have Dodger Stadium, which is very exotic. No longer are stadiums going to be relegated to cities. We're used to seeing a baseball stadium in a city like Ebbets Field. But Now you have one that's sort of in the suburbs, and it's 20 minutes from downtown, and you have the San Gabriel Mountains, and it looks beautiful on television. It looks modern then. It looks modern now, to me at least. And it was the debut. It was Walter O'Malley's brainchild to have a stadium at Chavez Ravine.
So then it gets to the space race and back to history. The space program for the United States was not always successful in the early 60s.
No.
A lot of disasters. But 62, the tide is turning.
Sure.
You have John Glenn early in the year.
Sure.
And then Kennedy later in the year says we're going to the moon at the end of the decade and return a man safely to the Earth. An interesting thing about it is, David, I think people believed it.
Right.
It happened, but I think they believed it in 62.
Well, that's what happens, Rob, when you have a president who can take rhetoric and use it to soar people's spirits. You felt uplifted. Kennedy was that kind of a figure. And when he gives that speech at Rice University and says, why do we do this? Why does Rice play Texas?
Right.
The crowd goes crazy.
Right, yes.
And
I love it.
we did believe it. But John Glenn orbiting the Earth for the first astronaut to orbit the Earth. We were behind the Russians still, but this said to the United States of America, hey, we can do this. We're catching up. And of course, he had to come down early. If you read The Right Stuff or you see the movie of the same name, you'll see that they thought there might be a problem with the heat shield. So that was another part that cemented his heroism and his icon status. Now, you have two others that year. You have Wally Schirra and Scott Carpenter. If you define success as sending the guy up and bringing him back safely, they were successful. Carpenter's capsule landed a couple hundred miles from where it was supposed to, and I go into that in the book. Wally Schirra's was picture perfect. And Kennedy was really the spearheading effort behind that. He was this guy who everyone turned to because as the president, he has to be. Even though it's LBJ who is really covering NASA, he's in charge of the space program. Everything comes towards him. And, that's why we have the space headquarters in Texas, largely because of LBJ. And LBJ also counseled Eisenhower on creating NASA.
Right.
So to catch up to the Russians was so incredibly important, Rob. And when you're talking about Glenn's impact on kids, I went to the Ohio State University, and that's the official name, the Ohio State University in Columbus, and John Glenn's papers are there. Well, they're numerous, and I could only pick a few. They said there are hundreds of boxes here because he kept everything. And they had fan letters, and I picked a few fan letters at random, and there was a booklet. It was a yearbook type of thing. Not a yearbook like you would get in high school, but like an 8th grade project. And I picked it up, I photocopied it, and I tracked down one of the contributors who was in junior high school, that particular junior high school at the time. And I said, you're not going to believe this. And I said my name and I explained what I'm doing. And she said, I don't believe you, but this sounds familiar. Email it to me. And then she called me back. She said, oh my God, this is a voice from the past. That was really full of serendipity to get fans like that of John Glenn and to track them down now that they're much older in their 60s and get their impressions of what it was like to be a fan of the space race, to follow it. It was part of everyday conversation at the dinner table, in schoolyards. This was something you talked about with your friends. If you wanted to be a fireman and you were, say, 6 years old in 1952, in 1962, a 6-year-old wanted to go to the moon because that's all he's hearing his parents talk about. And that's, he sees the launch, he sees the rockets going up. It's very exciting.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
The interesting thing about that Rice speech, Kennedy mentioned something in that speech, and when I listen to it, it just jars me. He talks about how Lindbergh goes across the Atlantic just 4 decades prior to that.
Right.
So within 50 years, we couldn't even fly across the Atlantic in a plane, and now we're going to go all the way to the moon. That kind of puts it into perspective on how daunting it was,
Sure.
and how amazing it was, and how it changed the mindset for the country.
Right. But if you look at what's happened the past 40 years, from 1980 to 2020, and I don't even know the word, progress isn't even a good word to describe it, but the advances in computer technology. I remember when computers were first introduced into junior high school in Springfield, New Jersey, they were TRS-80 computers from Radio Shack, and now you have a computer in the palm of your hand.
Right.
With more computing power. Your iPhone has way more computing power than that TRS-80 40 years ago. And I'm sure in 2060, people will see the technology we're using right now and say, man, that was really quaint what they used back then.
So back to baseball. Early in the season at 62, Bull Belinsky throws a no-hitter. He's just a young guy.
Right.
He's pitching for the Angels, so now he's in Los Angeles.
Right.
He's a superstar.
Yeah.
But his story is just fascinating.
Well, Bo, like myself, is a New Jersey native. Bo grew up in Trenton, which is about an hour from where I grew up in Springfield in the suburbs. But Trenton is a hardscrabble city, especially in the 50s. And he bounced around the minors, bounced around the majors. And with the LA Angels in 1962, he throws the first no-hitter in Major League Baseball on the West Coast. And it's all uphill from there until it's downhill. He has fame, he has money, he has women, he's dating famous actresses. And I've been telling people when they ask about Bo, it was a male fantasy until it wasn't. Because when you party like you think it's never going to end, there's a cost. And he suffered from alcoholism. He had a 28-51 lifetime record. He had 3 marriages that failed. And he found himself towards the end of his life in Las Vegas. The last 10, 12 years. He worked for a car company, a car dealership. This car dealership called Findlay became a Goliath in the Mountain States. It wasn't just one dealership. They had many throughout the Mountain States. And Findlay is a big factor in University of Nevada, Las Vegas sports, big sponsor. So Rich Abajian is an ex-UNLV football player, and he runs this company. And he takes Bo under his wing. Now, Rich, being an athlete, can talk to Bo on certain levels in a way that you and I can't, in a way that the other staff members can't. From the people with whom I spoke, Rob, they said that Bo looked up to Rich almost as a father figure, even though Rich was much younger. That was very interesting to me. And they were all willing to go on the record, to talk to me, to share their memories about Bo. And the Bo that you and I read about, that he dated Tina Louise and Connie Stevens, and he was engaged to Mamie Van Doren, and he used to go around and drink on the Sunset Strip and have the life of Riley. That's not the Bo that they knew. The Bo that they knew was gentler, courtlier, more gentlemanly, more reserved. It's an interesting trajectory because it's never too late to try for redemption. I don't know if he reconciled with his family, with his kids, because I didn't really get that far. But my impression is that he didn't. He knew that he had screwed up along the way. He had said that to some people. But he was trying. And had he lived another year, another 5 years, another 10 years, who knows what might have happened. He died at 64 in 2001. It's a very sad tale, but an uplifting one that at least he tried. And when people say, oh, well, it's a cautionary tale, and I point to that line in the play Jersey Boys about Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. And I actually grew up about 5 minutes from the lounge in that bowling alley that was named the Four Seasons, where they got the name. And there's a line in the play Jersey Boys where one of the members turns to the audience and talks about fidelity and talks about the women on the road and how they would throw cocktail napkins on the stage and they'd have 40, 50 phone numbers a night after performing in a nightclub. And he says very darkly, you go and sell 20 million records. Go see how you handle it. And Bo couldn't handle it. For whatever reason, the demons got the better of him, and it was the swinging 60s. He was in L.A. Mores and values might have been a little looser. And if he had played for Minneapolis or Detroit or Cleveland, maybe they wouldn't have come up. Maybe the temptations wouldn't have been as great.
Back to culture again, and it must have been fun to go into the TV of the 60s.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, that's a new age of television there in the 60s, and then the cinema of the 60s. So was that a good time to go into those aspects of the culture?
Oh, I loved it, Rob. I absolutely loved it because I had not been exposed to dramas. When you grow up in the late 70s and the 80s, you are beholden to what's on television, and for a good number of years, it's a three-channel universe. And then in New York, we had three independents. So you had three network channels, three independent channels. And if you're staying home sick from school, when you come home after school, what are you watching? It's Gilligan's Island, it's Bewitched, it's F Troop, I Dream of Jeannie, Hogan's Heroes, etc. Rather benign sitcoms. We were not exposed to dramas. The only drama I remember being rerun was Star Trek on Saturday afternoons on WPIX Channel 11. So when I do the research for Naked City or 87th Precinct or Route 66, this was a whole new world because I had heard about these shows, but I had never seen them. To say that the 60s, especially the early 60s, to say that it was a time of innocence and it was just saccharine and benign is ridiculous because, and I got that a lot. Friends were telling me, oh, Dave, that's great, the last year of innocence. No, not really. We almost went to nuclear war. Look at what's going on television at that time. I write in the book about an episode of Route 66. And for listeners who are too young to know or remember, Route 66 is about two guys in a Corvette, two guys in their 20s, and they drive around the country and explore. And everywhere they go, they get involved in people's problems and help them solve them. So here they are in Boston, and they're at one of the monuments, and a guy approaches them, and he's full of patriotic fervor. He's espousing freedom and the bravery of the soldiers who defended the country against the British. And it turns out that he's a white supremacist. And the FBI contacts these two guys, Buzz and Todd, played by George Maharis and Martin Milner, and they recruit them. They want to take down this white supremacist, and they get the two guys to help. That is such a scary proposition in terms of subject matter. And what's really hitting home is I think you can make that episode today and not change a single word. So as far as we've come with areas of social progress, that's as far as we still have to go.
The awesome event that will take place here today will never be forgotten. There are those who will call this event a crime. If it is, I demand to pay the price. I will be arrested and tried in open court. That is my intention. Then I will be heard. Though I may die a criminal's death, history will vindicate me.
You're a liar! History will put you with Benedict Arnold, because you're a traitor.
In the eyes of history, I'll be a patriot.
You're a coward! You're the liar! You're gutless! Anybody with any courage wouldn't let other people die while you stay alive! Monitor, throw the light back at his teeth! Yell up! Monitor, show the world how a man can die!
No!
somebody else once said, this American world is not made for me.
So back to baseball again. That year in 62, iconic players.
Sure.
Mantle for the Yankees, and then, of course, Maury Wills, who completely changed the game for the Dodgers.
Sure.
According to legend, the Giants even wetted the field down. They couldn't stop him, so they just made the field wetter. Maybe that could slow him down.
Right.
Of course, you got Willie Mays, and then the fantastic pitchers, Drysdale, Koufax, Whitey Ford, Juan Marichal.
Right.
Were there others out there that need to be brought up? Because we know all of those iconic players from 62. And, of course, they're the MVPs and the Cy Young winners. But how about some unsung heroes from 62?
Well, sure. Look at someone like Tommy Davis for Los Angeles. He batted .346 that year. He led the National League. He led the major leagues, in fact. So he gets overshadowed by Maury. And so does Drysdale to a certain degree. Drysdale won the Cy Young Award. He gets 25 wins. But Maury Wills stealing 104 bases is such an astonishing achievement. And when I had the opportunity to talk to Maury, he said that he had a green light. He could go whenever he wanted. If he thought that he could steal, he didn't need permission. He didn't have to look to a coach for a sign. Walter Alston, the manager, said to him, if you think you can make it, then you run. And when I'm talking to Dodger fans, Rob, you know that sports is a very tribal business. Cardinals fans have traditions and lore. So do Mets fans and Yankees fans. Dodger Stadium, imagine being a Dodger fan in 1962. You have this beautiful new ballpark. The seats are these bright aquamarine colors. And you have 40, 50,000 people standing up whenever Maury's on first, and they're chanting, yelling, shouting, go, go, go. That's being a part of something very, very special. And that season, I can imagine being a Dodger fan and thinking, this is a season of destiny. Drysdale's on the mound, winning 25 games. Tommy Davis is belting the hell out of the ball. Maury Wills is stealing bases almost at will. Unfortunately for LA, they tied. They did not secure the pennant. They tied, forcing a 3-game playoff, which, as we both know, was pretty rare back then. And the Giants took the pennant and then went on to play the Yankees.
Mike taking his stretch. Look at third. Here's the pitch. A fly ball to short center. Mays makes the catch. Here comes Wells to the plate. Here comes the throw. And it's not in time. That ball was just a little bit too deep. And the Dodgers have won the second game of this playoff. The Giants questioning John Buchanan whether the runner left third too soon, and he says no, that he left in time.
You know, the interesting thing about that, in the AL that year, so I think Maury Wills had 104 stolen bases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that broke the record from Ty Cobb.
Sure.
If I get the stats correct. But in the American League that year, the leading stolen base player had 30 or 31 stolen bases.
Yeah.
I mean, he was on another level.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the Dodgers didn't have one person in the top 10. Even the Mets had one in the top 10 for the major leagues in terms of home runs. So the Dodgers were more of a finesse team, I would argue. But you have Killebrew and Aaron and Frank Robinson in the 2, 3, and 4 slots in home runs. And Mays, of course, being number 1 with 49. And Mays is an interesting figure. That's an interesting year, even though his batting average dropped a little bit. He was in his early 30s. Now, when you're 31, 32 years old, you are still in shape. You're still young. You can still go out and play. But Rob, he played in every single game. Played in every single game. I mean, that is just astonishing to me. And I'm looking at Baseball Reference. It says 162. I'm assuming they don't count playoffs as part of that. So I'm assuming that's the regular season number. But even so, if he's playing in 157 or more, even 155 or more at that age, just incredible. And the power he had with 49 home runs. I think it was Tim McCarver. It might have been another catcher, but I think it was Tim McCarver of your beloved Cardinals, who asked Mays a question at the plate, and Mays answered it while he hit the home run. I mean, that's how matter of fact it was. And later on, I think just a few years ago, Mays said, I could hit a home run whenever I wanted.
Mays, the batter. 1 out and 1 on. Pittsburgh and Milwaukee rained out. There's a pitch. Outside curve, ball 3. 3 balls, 1 strike. Right-hand batter digging in. Bob Gibson with a 1-run lead. Into the stretch. The 3-1 pitch. Here it is. And there it goes. Way back. It might be out of here. It could be. It is a home run into right center. His 20th home run of the year. So Willie gave us 1 run and then just got 2 back. Mays hit a 3-1 pitch into the right center field pavilion. And the Giants, just like that, lead 2-1. And you almost knew that was going to happen.
Well, in the midst of all of that, the country has one of the greatest crises in all of its history, and that's the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
And that was right there in October.
Right. I would say it was probably the greatest. We were very close to a nuclear exchange, according to all of the literature and the scholarship. The JFK speech on that night, the night he addresses the nation, is chilling, to say the least. He basically says if the Russians via Cuba set off these missiles that they have, it's an act of war and we'll retaliate. We will retaliate in full. I had the opportunity, and everyone does, Rob, on YouTube, there's a clip of Eisenhower, former President Eisenhower, talking to Kennedy. Kennedy's seeking his counsel. And they're talking just a few hours before the president gives the speech to the nation on television. And they're talking about the strategy of the Russians and whether they should invade Cuba. And you remember the Bay of Pigs debacle happened the previous year. So just the word invasion sends chills throughout the White House staff. And Eisenhower saying, well, something might tell them to set the things off. I don't think this will, and you have to do what you have to do. And it's just a really good peek into how these guys at the highest levels respected one another, even though they're different generations, different parties, but they know what it's like to be in the big chair, and very few people do.
Well, I thank you for telling me, and I will, personally, I think you're really making the only move you can.
Yeah, it's tough to, as I say, we will, I don't know, we may get into the invasion business before many days are out. Yeah. But
from a course, military standpoint, that's a clean-cut thing to do now.
That's right.
Because you've made up your mind, you've got to get rid of this thing.
Right.
The only real way to get rid of it, of course, is the other thing. But it's having to be concerned with world opinion
and Berlin.
Why you got to do a little slower.
Well, Berlin is the, I suppose, that may be what they're going to try to trade off.
Might, but I personally, I just don't quite go along, with that thinking, Mr. President. My idea is this. The damn Soviets will do whatever they want, what they figure is good for them.
Yeah.
And I don't believe they relate one situation with another. That's what they find out they can do here and there and the other place.
Yeah.
And we're already standing at the unit with NATO that if they go into Berlin, that's all of it.
Right.
That means they've got to look out that they don't get a terrific blow themselves.
Right.
And I don't, it might be, I could be all wrong, but my own conviction is that you will not find a great deal of relationship between them.
Let me ask you.
They'll try to make it that way.
General, what about if the Soviet Union, Khrushchev announces tomorrow, which I think he will, that if we attack Cuba, that it's going to be nuclear war? And what's your judgment as to the chances they'll fire these things off if we invade Cuba?
I don't believe it will.
You don't think they will? In other words, you would take that risk if the situation seems hard.
As a matter of fact, what can you do? If this thing is such a serious thing here on our flank, that we're going to be uneasy, and we know what's happening now. All right, you've got to use something. Something may make these people shoot them off. I just don't believe this will.
Yeah, right. Well,
in any event, of course, I'll say this. I'd want to keep my own people very alert.
Yeah. Well, hang on tight.
Yes, sir.
Thanks a lot, General.
All right, thanks.
And then there were some important women that are covered in your book. And of course, Marilyn Monroe died that summer.
Right.
But there's a couple of others as well.
Well, Mary Early is not only an icon, she's an angel. Mary gave me several hours of her time. She was the first black graduate of the University of Georgia. A lot of people have asked me if I wrote about James Meredith. I said not too much, because Mr. Meredith's story about being the first black student at the University of Mississippi, that's been told. I can't add any value. I can't tell you anything that you don't already know or can't find very easily. So I knew civil rights needed to be a part of this. And when I found Mary Early, first black graduate at the University of Georgia, and her papers are at UGA in Athens. And there's a funny story about that. I go through the papers. There are letters from the highest levels of the university. There's a report. She asked me if I found the report. I said, I'm holding it in my hands. They did an investigation on her. Things as simple as parking tickets or traffic tickets, absolutely ridiculous. Things that you would never ask a white student. And they investigated her family as well. Mary Early's papers are in the Richard Russell building. And Richard Russell was one of the most vocal opponents of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So there's something very karma-related in terms of her papers being housed in a building named for Senator Russell.
So then that playoff, that 3-game playoff, what can you tell me about that? It went to the third game. Was there drama involved in that 3-game playoff between the Dodgers and the Giants?
Sure, because you have echoes of 1951 and Ralph Branca and Bobby Thompson. If you're a Giants fan, you still haven't gotten over it. If you're a Giants fan, you haven't gotten over the celebration. If you're a Dodgers fan, you haven't gotten over the mourning and the depression. I mean, I talked to guys when I was doing the research for the Dodgers book, and they said, David, it's only been 70 years. Maybe in another 70, I'll be able to talk about it. But yeah, the Giants defeated the Dodgers in 3 games. They won 2 out of 3. And what can you say about the disappointment for Dodger fans? Everything seems to be going the right way. Almost like in 2001, after 9/11, and the Yankees kept battling back in the World Series, and you think, oh, this would be so great for New York. What an emotional boon that the Yankees are going to win the World Series, and they lost to Arizona. It's a funny thing, this baseball history and the trajectories that teams take and that we take because we're emotionally invested. But San Francisco, 5th year in the West Coast, the Giants had moved with the Dodgers after 57, as you know. And we talk a lot about L.A. winning in the second year. In 59, they beat the White Sox to win the World Series. Second year in existence in Los Angeles, the Dodgers ball club wins the World Series. We forget that San Francisco goes to the World Series only 5 years after being on the West Coast. And that's a pretty big accomplishment. Of course, they play the Yankees, and I offer a prologue about the last at-bat in the World Series. It's Willie McCovey, and he lines out to Bobby Richardson to end the 7th game. The Yankees win, and it prompts Charles Schultz to write a comic strip with Charlie Brown and Linus. 4-panel comic strip. The first 3 panels, neither character does anything. And in the 4th, Charlie Brown screams, "Why couldn't McCovey have hit the ball just 3 feet higher?" And then a couple of months later, same exact setup, except why couldn't McCovey have hit the ball just 2 feet higher? Because Schultz at that time lived in Northern California, and he was using Charlie Brown as a conduit for the emotional desperation of Giants fans.
So during that year, Rachel Carson releases Silent Spring.
Oh, yeah.
And there's other literature. So did you enjoy getting into the literature that was produced in 62?
Oh, absolutely, Rob. I'm a voracious reader, so I bought Failsafe and 7 Days in May and Advise and Consent. The movie came out that year, but I made it a point to read the book, or I should say reread it. I had read it about 10 years ago. The book was in 59, and I wanted to compare the book to the movie. Sex and the Single Girl with Helen Gurley Brown, and I really went off on that because Helen Gurley Brown is this feminist icon, but in the book, she really took jabs at housewives, at women who maybe didn't have to work for a living, if the husband could make a living that would support her staying at home and taking care of the kids and so forth. And it was really condescending towards her. And I remember reading that. I was down the street in a park and reading that, and I'm like, man, if you're going to be a feminist, you need to defend all women. You need to be an endorser and an encourager and a cheerleader for all women, not just women who you think deserve it or who look like you or act like you. And I went home, and people will read in the book, I really laid out reasons why that's not only ineffective but almost mean-spirited. She talks about women glomming on to men, and I make the point that for a very long time in this country, up until about the mid-60s, maybe even the 70s, relationships and marriages were tribal. You married within your tribe. There weren't a lot of occasions of intermarriages, whether it was religion or a white person marrying a person of color. It happened, but it didn't happen a lot. And it was done to perpetuate traditions. Catholics marrying Catholics, Jews marrying Jews, etc. And I really took exception to some of the things that she had in that book. Because, look, I'm all for equal rights and everybody being treated the same, which is to say with respect. But, man, she's an icon in terms of empowerment of women, and it didn't seem like she was empowering all the women in that chapter. That's in Chapter 11. People can read all about the literature in 1962.
So then we have to talk about the World Series, 1962, the Yankees and the Giants.
Well, like I said, the line out was so sudden because, for being a Cardinals fan and watching games, if it's a pop fly, there's always a chance it's going to drop. But a line out is so quick. Mm-hmm. It's so fast. It's over before you know it. And like I said before, Rob, the Giants weren't wallflowers, anything but. It was a very tough series. It was a very hard-fought series. You have Whitey Ford winning Game 1, and then San Francisco comes back with a shutout in Game 2. Jack Sanford is on the mound. The Yankees win in Game 3. The Giants win in Game 4. This is a seesaw type of an effect here. And when it comes down to a 1-0 game, bottom of the ninth, what's more exciting than a bottom of the ninth situation? It's 1-0, you have two men on, two outs, and the biggest slugger in the league next to Mays is at bat. I mean, McCovey was a towering figure. Mm-hmm. Whenever I play Stratomatic, the Hall of Fame edition, he's always my first pick because he was so good. I think he was in the shadow of Mays for quite a bit, but he was a San Francisco favorite. He was just an icon in that city. To have him at the last at-bat was so appropriate. It was so dramatic. And then, of course, San Francisco didn't get back to the series for a while, and Mays didn't get back till 73 when he was with the Mets.
The interesting thing about that, you think of the Yankees as mashing, and you got guys like Maris and Mantle, and the reality is they batted under 200 in that series.
Yeah, it was not a great one for Mr. Mantle. You have someone like Matty Alou batting 333, did quite well. Elson Howard didn't do too well in that series, batted below 150. So it was disappointing on a lot of levels, but you sort of see the beginning of the end of the Yankee dominance in the AL in that 63 they get swept, 64 they lose to your beloved Cardinals. Go St. Louis, go yes, Cards.
Go Cards.
And after that, it's a decade of mediocrity. The teams don't come back until 76 when they go to the World Series against the Reds, and then in 77 and 78 they beat the Dodgers back-to-back. So you're starting to sense that it's the end. Mantle stayed on for a while. He stayed on until 67. And if you watch that clip of him hitting his 500th home run, it's on YouTube. He can barely make it around the bases. He's basically limping as he's trotting. And that's pretty sad. So who knows if injuries had anything to do with his performance in 62. He was coming off a monster year in 61 when he and Maris were battling for the Babe Ruth home run record.
The Yankees go on the road and won't be back until Memorial Day. May the 30th, doubleheader against the Minnesota Twins. First game at 1. Here's the payoff pitch. This is it! There it goes! It's out of here!
So through all your research, You must have dipped into all kinds of different archives.
Oh, absolutely.
Was there anything that specifically completely surprised you?
First of all, I have to thank Rob Taylor at the University of Nebraska Press and his team, because I would call every few months or email and say, I found more research, I need an extension. I found another movie I need to watch, I need an extension. Trust me, it's going to be good. It's going to be good for the book. And they gave me the extension. I was just thrilled. What surprised me, the passage that we just talked about, Helen Gurley Brown, the movies that came out that year, Lolita, very uncomfortable subject matter, a middle-aged man having an affair with an underage girl. You have Advise and Consent, which is a very sobering look at politics, and I don't think that much has changed, but it's a fantastic movie. It's my favorite movie about politics. And if you're going to watch the movie, which is on YouTube, certainly the book is a must. I guess the thing that surprised me the most was the feeling of unity, and maybe that's because we're in a time of disunion. We're in a time of divisiveness. It's mean-spirited. We've always had disagreements, but I grew up in the 80s, and I remember when Ronald Reagan would have press conferences, and I was a teenager, so you're too young to be an adult, you're too old to be a kid, you're starting to figure out the world and figure out who you are, and we're studying history in high school, so I figure, well, wouldn't hurt to watch a press conference here and there. There was a congeniality that he had. If you read about Reagan from the people who know him or knew him, he and Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House, always battled it out. But at the end of the day, they put aside their differences and they got to work. And it was the same thing when Johnson was Senate Majority Leader when Eisenhower was president. And Johnson always worked with Eisenhower. We've lost a lot of that, as you know, in the past few years. I don't think it was just Donald Trump. I know people will say that. I think it had started before that. But there's something missing. So when I talk to people who were around in 62 who have those memories, it's a little sad for me because I think, well, why couldn't we have had that? Why did that not continue throughout the years, throughout the decades?
That brings me to my last question, just about that year in 1962. It almost feels like America can do anything.
Yeah.
And of course, there'll be terrible things that happen, the assassination of JFK and the Vietnam War, and
right.
the violence that'll erupt from the civil rights movement that really wasn't as present in the early 1960s. But in 62, it looks like America can do anything.
There's a sense of community nationwide. There's a sense that we're all in it together, whether it's Kennedy with the Cuban Missile Crisis and resolving it 13 days, or Kennedy giving the speech at Rice University. And everyone is proud to be an American. Now, America has a lot of faults. We all know that. It's imperfect. We strive for perfection. We don't achieve it. But we try. We try to improve. And there was a sense, largely because of the space race, I would argue. But if you look at what was going on in television, in movies, they were challenging audiences. Audiences were more sophisticated. By the time of the late 50s, audiences were ready for something different. So that's why you have a 77 Sunset Strip or the Dick Van Dyke Show, which was very sophisticated comedy. You didn't know what Robert Young did on Father Knows Best, not really. You didn't know what Ward Cleaver's job was on Leave It to Beaver, but you saw Rob Petrie go to an office and write for a bombastic comedy star every week. And then he would come home to New Rochelle, and the two universes overlapped. And Mary Tyler Moore, who played his wife on the Dick Van Dyke Show, she used that template in her show of the 70s, where she had her apartment in that Victorian home and then later an apartment in a building. She had WJM television. Rhoda would come to the newsroom, and Lou and Ted would come to a party at her apartment. There was a certain sophistication in the air, and it was a turning point, I think, in terms of culture for the country. And one of the things that I like to do, if it's possible, Rob, is to find connections. And one of my favorite episodes of the Andy Griffith Show is the episode where Barney has to shoo off these guys selling fruit by the side of the road. It's illegal. And Andy does it. He makes up this story about Barney being a really violent, tough cop. They later find out that it was untrue. And Barney goes back by himself. Barney and Andy drive. Barney makes Andy stay in the car. He says, I need to do this myself. And he chases the guys off. He stands up to them. That happened 2 weeks after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. And I make the point in the book, as an analogy, there might have been something in the zeitgeist. There might have been something in the viewer's psyche that here's Barney standing up to two guys who are supposedly tougher and meaner and not afraid to get their hands dirty, but he stands up and faces them down. Kind of what Kennedy did.
Well, I got to commend you, David. It's a great read.
Thank you.
And there's a little something for everybody.
Absolutely.
It's really fun to go into all of the cultural references that you have, and then, of course, the amazing baseball of '62. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a peek into what life was like in 1962. If you were around back then, I hope it will ignite some memories for you. If you were too young or weren't alive then it will give you a sense, without getting into a time machine, of what life was like in terms of culture, the popular culture, sport, and politics.
Well, great work, David. Thanks again.
Thank you.
I would like to thank my guest today, historian and author David Krell. And if you would like to get his new book, 1962, Baseball and America in the Time of JFK, just click on the link in the description below. The featured brew was Old Slugger Pale Ale, the flagship beer of the Cooperstown Brewing Company of Cooperstown, New York. If you liked our talk today, please share this episode with a friend. And remember, subscribe to the podcast. For more information on authors and other books, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page. The music was provided by the great North Carolina band Bones Fork. And if you want to know what they have going on, just click on their link. It's in the description below as well. Once again, I have to say thank you to the expanding list of supporters and listeners from over 60 countries and 1,000 cities. There are many more great episodes on the way, with discussions on a most peculiar book, The Inherent Strangeness of the Bible, At the Sands, the casino that shaped classic Las Vegas, Call Sign Chaos, Learning to Lead, The Lost History of Ford and Edison's American Utopia, and the amazing history of the First Crusade. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
We must move on from the reassuring repetition of stale phrases to a new, difficult, but essential confrontation with reality. For the great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Too often we hold fast to the cliches of our forebears. We subject all facts to a prefabricated set of interpretations. We enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. Mythology distracts us everywhere.